In the heart of a vast intergalactic station, people from all across the universe gathered. Alien species of all sizes and colors walked the bustling marketplace, exchanging goods, stories, and sometimes threats. Amidst the crowd was a petted alien girl named Lyra. Her skin shimmered with a soft, otherworldly glow, and her large eyes reflected the stars. She wasn't tall or imposing like many of the warriors and travelers who roamed the station. In fact, Lyra was often overlooked, passed by without a second glance. But there was something about her, something that made people uneasy when they got too close. The rumors about Lyra's people were well known. Her species, the Vantari, were said to possess extraordinary abilities. They could manipulate energy, control minds, and even bend time itself. But there was a catch. Nobody had seen these powers for generations. Lyra was young, and as far as anyone knew, her people had lost their powers long ago. Still, the legends persisted, and in a place like this, it was better to be safe than sorry. Lyra wasn't looking for trouble. She kept to the edges of the station, avoiding the more dangerous crowds. She knew that her appearance, small, delicate, and unassuming, made her an easy target, but she couldn't hide forever. One day, as she moved through the market, a group of rowdy alien thugs noticed her. At first, they made fun of her. A few laughs here, a few jabs there. But the insults soon turned into something more dangerous. They surrounded her, blocking her way, their eyes gleaming with malice. Lyra could feel the weight of their stares, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that showing fear only encouraged people like this. The thugs began to push her, taunting her. One of them, a bulky creature with 3 eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth, reached out to grab her arm. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but Lyra could sense something different about these men. They were far more dangerous than the others. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But then, just as the thug's hand closed around her arm, a voice broke through the tension. "Hey!" The voice was sharp, commanding, and full of authority. The thugs turned, surprised. Standing at the entrance of the alley was a man. He was tall and built, with dark hair and a confident stance. His eyes scanned the group, noting their weapons and body language. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. The thugs laughed, clearly unimpressed by the newcomer. They had dealt with far scarier beings than a human before. But there was something about him, something that made them hesitate. Maybe it was his posture, or the way his hands rested on the weapons at his side, but they couldn't shake the feeling that this human wasn't afraid of them. One of the thugs took a step forward, cracking his knuckles. "This doesn't concern you, human," he sneered. "Walk away before we make you." The man didn't move. He just stared at the thug, his eyes cold and calculating. "Not happening," he said firmly. "Now you let her go." The thug took a swing at him. The human, without even flinching, dodged the blow with surprising speed. In one smooth motion, he grabbed the thug's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The other thugs hesitated for a moment, confused by the human's skill. Then they attacked all at once, thinking they could overpower him. But they were wrong. The man moved quickly, knocking aside their weapons and using his surroundings to his advantage. He wasn't the strongest, but his speed and resourcefulness were enough. One by one, the thugs fell to the ground, defeated and bruised. The whole encounter lasted less than a minute. The alley was silent again, except for the sound of heavy breathing. Lyra stood frozen, her heart racing. She had never seen anyone fight like that before. Humans were supposed to be weak, inferior beings. At least, that was what many of the other alien species said. But this human had just taken on 4 grown men and one. It wasn't just strength that made him powerful. It was his mind. His ability to think fast, adapt, and never give up. The man turned to her, his expression softening. He wiped a smear of blood from his lip and nodded. "You all right?" Lyra didn't answer at first. She was still in shock. Her people were supposed to be the ones everyone feared, not humans. Yet here was this human, standing tall and confident, saving her life. For a moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Thank you," she finally stammered. The human smiled, a grin that showed a hint of amusement. "No need to thank me. Just doing what anyone would do." But Lyra wasn't so sure. Not everyone would have done what he just did. There was something about him, something that made him different. She didn't understand it, but she was starting to realize that this human, this Jack, might be the one person who could change everything. The streets of the intergalactic trading station were always filled with noise. People shouting, machines whirring, and ships flying overhead. But for Lyra, it felt like the world had gone quiet. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The way the human, Jack, had stood up to those thugs so easily was something she'd never seen before. Most aliens avoided conflict when they could, especially with a dangerous crowd like that. But Jack had stepped in without hesitation, his calm attitude a sharp contrast to the chaos around them. Lyra glanced over at him as they walked through the station's winding halls. He had a steady stride, not too fast, not too slow. His dark eyes were scanning their surroundings constantly, as if expecting trouble. Lyra was still processing everything that had happened. In all her travels, she had never met someone quite like Jack. He was different from the warriors and traders she'd encountered. There was a quiet strength about him that made her feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Lyra nodded quickly, trying to hide her discomfort. "I'm fine," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I've been in worse situations." Jack raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. He could tell she was hiding something. Most people would have been terrified after what had just happened. But Lyra seemed almost used to danger. It didn't make sense to him. She was small, delicate-looking, but her calmness in the face of aggression didn't match her appearance. They reached a quieter part of the station, away from the crowds. Jack found a small, dimly lit room in a nearby alley and motioned for Lyra to follow him. It was far from luxurious, but it would be a safe place to talk without being overheard. The door shut behind them with a quiet click. Lyra sat down on a crate, still not looking directly at Jack. Her mind raced. She didn't know whether she should trust him or not. Sure, he had helped her, but there was still something about him she couldn't quite figure out. He was human, and humans were not exactly known for being allies to her kind. In fact, many saw humans as weak, especially in a place like this, where power and strength ruled the day. Jack leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "I want to help you," he said simply, "but I need to know what's going on. Why were those guys after you?" Lyra stiffened at his words. She had never been good at talking about herself, especially with someone she barely knew. But she couldn't lie to him. Not after everything he had just done for her. There was something about Jack that made her want to trust him, even though she knew she shouldn't. Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke. "They were after me because of my people," she began, her voice quiet. "The Vantari. We were once powerful. We had abilities that other species feared, but over time, our powers faded. No one believes we can still do the things we used to do, but some people, some groups, still want to control us." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. "Control you? But you don't look. I mean, I've never seen anything special about you." He paused, realizing how that sounded. "I mean, no offense. You just seem like, well, like a regular person." Lyra's eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger. "I may look like just a person, but there's more to me than meets the eye." She stood up abruptly, her small frame suddenly full of energy. "You don't understand. My species, we were once the most feared in the galaxy. But when our powers faded, we became targets. The stories about us, the myths, they don't help. They only make things worse. People still hunt us down, hoping to find the power that once was." Jack stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It was a lot to take in, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't lying. There was more to Lyra than her fragile appearance. "So, those thugs, they weren't just messing with you for fun?" Jack asked slowly, his mind catching up. Lyra shook her head. "No, they were hired by the Khazar cartel. They've been hunting the last of my kind for years. I'm the only one left. I don't know why they want me, but I have a feeling it's not just to kill me." Jack chewed on that for a moment. The Khazar cartel was a ruthless group of mercenaries and criminals, and they didn't go after people unless they had a reason. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was part of something bigger. And now, it seemed, Lyra was caught in the middle of it. "You don't have to do this alone," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll help you get out of here. We'll figure this out together." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his words. "Why would you help me?" she asked quietly. "You don't even know me, and I'm not sure I can trust you." Jack shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Sometimes trust has to start somewhere. Besides, I don't think you'd last long without a little help. And from what I can see, you've got something worth fighting for." Lyra hesitated. For a moment, she considered turning him away. But deep down, she knew she couldn't do this alone. She had been running for too long. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but you need to know this. I don't want to hide anymore. I'm not just some scared girl. If I'm going to survive, I have to fight back." Jack smiled, his confidence unwavering. "Then it's a good thing I'm on your side." The small, dimly lit room where Jack and Lyra sat was a world away from the chaos of the station. The steady hum of the intergalactic markets felt distant now, as the two of them began to plan their next move. Lyra, still uneasy about everything that had happened, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The room felt too quiet, too empty. Her instincts, honed by years of surviving in dangerous environments, were screaming at her to be careful. Jack, on the other hand, seemed calm, collected even. He was studying the holographic map that hovered between them, the soft blue light reflecting off his face. He had been in situations like this before, dangerous, unpredictable, and messy. But Lyra's situation was different. She was different. "So, the Khazar cartel knows about you, and they're after you because of your people's abilities?" Jack asked, his voice steady. "You said they've been hunting your kind for years. Why haven't they found you before?" Lyra looked down, twisting her fingers nervously. "I've been hiding, moving from place to place. Most of the time, it worked. But the cartel doesn't give up easily. They have resources, information. They know where to look." She paused for a moment, her eyes darkening. "I thought I could stay hidden, but now it feels like they're closing in." Jack leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "We'll change that. We're going to take control. They're the ones who should be running, not you." Lyra's gaze softened for a moment. There was something about Jack's words, his unwavering confidence, that gave her hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she didn't have to keep running. Maybe it was time to fight back. But before she could say anything, a loud bang echoed from the hallway outside the room. Both of them jumped, instinctively reaching for their weapons. Jack stood up first, moving silently to the door. Lyra followed, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if it was the cartel or just a random threat, but she had learned to expect the worst. Jack cracked the door slightly, peering through the small gap. His eyes scanned the hallway, and then he gave a quick nod to Lyra, signaling that it was clear. "Stay close," Jack whispered as he stepped into the hall, his movements smooth and practiced. Lyra kept close behind, her senses alert. They moved quietly, blending into the shadows, staying out of sight from any potential threats. They reached a nearby control room, where Jack quickly accessed the station's security system. His fingers flew across the touchscreen, bypassing the layers of security with ease. Lyra watched, impressed. There was no doubt in her mind now. Jack was more than just a fighter. He was skilled, resourceful, and he knew how to survive in a place like this. "What are you doing?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Jack didn't look up, his focus on the screen. "I'm pulling up the cartel's movement patterns. If we can figure out where they're most active, we can predict where they'll go next. We'll know where to strike before they even know we're coming." Lyra nodded, impressed. "I didn't think you would be this prepared." Jack gave a small grin. "I'm not just a brawler. I'm a problem solver. And right now, we have a big problem to solve." After a few tense moments, the screen flashed with a series of coordinates. Jack's fingers hovered over the screen, and he studied the data carefully. "There," he said, pointing to one of the locations, "the cartel's base of operations. It's heavily guarded, but if we approach from this angle," he traced a route with his finger, "we might have a shot at getting in without being detected." Lyra looked at the map, her mind racing. This was it. This was the chance she had been waiting for, but there was still a part of her that hesitated. The Khazar cartel was dangerous, ruthless. They wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way, and Lyra wasn't sure she was ready to face them head-on. Jack seemed to sense her hesitation. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I know you're scared. I get it. But we don't have a choice. If we don't act, they'll keep hunting you. They'll keep coming after you, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Lyra bit her lip, her thoughts swirling. She wasn't sure if she was ready to go all in, but Jack's determination was hard to ignore. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing in thought. This was her chance. This was her fight. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's do it." Jack nodded, a small, approving smile crossing his face. "Good. We leave in an hour. Get ready." Lyra couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline. The plan was set. The fight was on. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about taking back control of her own destiny. As they left the control room and made their way back through the station's winding halls, Lyra couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. She had never been the one to lead before. But with Jack by her side, maybe it was time to start. Together, they would take on the cartel. Together, they would fight for her freedom. The plan was set. Lyra and Jack had spent the last hour preparing, gathering weapons, supplies, and any information they could get their hands on. The cartel's base was just a few miles away, and they had to move quickly. Lyra could feel the tension building in her chest. She wasn't used to planning a fight, but the thought of facing the cartel head-on, with Jack by her side, made her feel more confident than she had in a long time. They moved through the shadows of the station, their steps quiet but purposeful. Lyra's mind raced as she followed Jack. She had spent years running, hiding, trying to survive. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't running. She was going to fight. "We'll approach from the west," Jack whispered, his voice low. "That's the least guarded route. The main entrance is a fortress. If we try to go through the front, they'll see us coming." Lyra nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She trusted Jack's plan. He had shown her that he wasn't just a fighter, but a strategist too. He knew how to think several steps ahead, something Lyra had learned to appreciate over the past few hours. They reached the edge of the station's docking bay, where Jack had arranged for a small, stealth ship to be waiting. It wasn't much, just a small craft meant for short trips. But it would get them close to the cartel's base without being detected. Lyra took a deep breath as she climbed into the ship, settling into the seat next to Jack. The controls were simple, and Jack seemed to know exactly what he was doing as he powered up the ship. The soft hum of the engines filled the small cabin as the ship lifted off the ground. Lyra kept her eyes on the view through the small window, watching as the station grew smaller in the distance. The night sky stretched out in front of them, dark and endless. She could hear the faint sound of the ship's engines as they cut through the silence. It was only a short trip, but every second felt like an eternity. As they neared the cartel's base, Lyra could see the massive compound in the distance. It was a sprawling complex, with high walls and towering security turrets. The cartel didn't leave anything to chance. Their base was a fortress, designed to keep out anyone who wasn't welcome. "Get ready," Jack murmured, his fingers tightening on the controls. "We're almost there." The ship veered to the side, avoiding the main entrance and heading toward a narrow alley between two large buildings. It was risky, but it was their only option. The ship slipped through the shadows, unseen by the guards on patrol. Lyra's heart raced as they neared the compound. The cartel's base was well defended, but Jack's plan was working. They were getting closer, and soon they would be inside. She felt a mix of fear and excitement. She had always been a survivor, but this was the first time she was actively fighting back. It felt powerful and terrifying at the same time. The ship slowed as they approached a small, unguarded landing pad on the edge of the compound. Jack made a quick, smooth landing, and the ship settled into place with a quiet thud. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes narrowed in focus. "Stay low, stay quiet," Jack whispered as they prepared to exit the ship. Lyra nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. This was it. There was no turning back now. They slipped out of the ship and into the shadows, moving quickly and silently toward the compound's perimeter. Lyra's eyes were sharp as she scanned the area. She could see a few guards patrolling, but they were far enough away that it wasn't a problem. They had to stay undetected. If the cartel knew they were coming, it would be over before they even had a chance to fight. Jack led the way, his movements fluid and precise. Lyra followed closely behind, her senses heightened. She had never felt more alive. They were close now, closer to the cartel than she had ever been. She could almost taste the danger in the air. They reached a small door at the back of the compound, hidden behind a stack of crates. Jack motioned for Lyra to stop and crouch low. He carefully checked the door, testing the handle. It opened with a soft click. They were in. Inside the compound, the air was thick with the scent of metal and machinery. The walls were lined with rows of crates, weapons, and supplies. It was clear that the cartel had a vast network, but this wasn't their headquarters. This was just a small part of their operation. Jack signaled for Lyra to follow as they moved through the dark corridors, staying out of sight. They needed to find the central control room, where they could gather the information they needed to take down the cartel once and for all. As they turned a corner, Lyra froze. A guard was coming down the hallway, heading straight for them. Her heart skipped a beat, but Jack was already moving, pulling her into a small supply closet just as the guard passed by. They held their breath, waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade away. After a tense moment, Jack let out a quiet breath and signaled for Lyra to follow. They had made it past one obstacle, but they both knew that there were more to come. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. The cartel was dangerous, and the deeper they went into the compound, the more at risk they were. But Lyra was ready. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back, and she wasn't going to stop until the cartel was brought down. The deeper they went into the cartel's compound, the more dangerous it became. Lyra could feel the tension building in her chest with every turn they took. They had moved past guards, hidden in supply rooms, and now they were getting closer to their goal, the control room. But each step felt like a risk, and Lyra's nerves were on edge. Jack led the way, his pace steady and confident. He had been through this before. He knew how to navigate enemy territory, how to think ahead. Lyra, on the other hand, had never been in a situation like this. She had always been on the run, always the one trying to stay one step ahead. But tonight, she was fighting back, and it felt both terrifying and empowering. "Almost there," Jack whispered, his voice low. "Just a little further." Lyra nodded, her hand gripping the handle of her weapon. She could hear voices up ahead, guards patrolling the halls. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and it would all be over. They reached a set of double doors at the end of the hall, just as the guards turned the corner. Jack pressed himself against the wall, motioning for Lyra to do the same. The guards passed by, unaware of their presence. Lyra held her breath, waiting for them to disappear down the hall. Once the footsteps faded, Jack nodded and moved toward the door. With a swift movement, he pulled out a small device from his pocket. He pressed it against the door's security panel, and after a brief moment, the light on the panel turned green. The door slid open silently. Inside, the room was dark, with only a few low lights illuminating rows of computers and screens. Lyra's heart raced as they stepped into the control room. The hum of machinery filled the air, and she could see the screens flashing with data. This was it, the nerve center of the cartel's operations. Jack quickly moved to one of the terminals, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "We need to get the data on their operations, their weaponry, anything we can use against them," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Lyra stood guard, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of movement. She knew they didn't have much time. The cartel would notice their presence soon enough. She could already hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway outside. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. "Got it," Jack said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "I've downloaded everything we need. Let's go." But just as they were about to leave, the door to the control room slammed open, and two guards rushed inside. Lyra's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't hesitate. In a split second, she drew her weapon and fired. The first guard collapsed to the ground, his body crumpling as the shot hit him square in the chest. The second guard reached for his weapon, but before he could draw it, Jack was on him, knocking the gun out of his hands with a swift strike. The guard tried to fight back, but Jack was faster, more skilled. He disarmed the guard and threw him against the wall, knocking him unconscious. Lyra exhaled, her pulse racing. "That was too close," she whispered, glancing around the room. She knew they couldn't stay long. The cartel would send more reinforcements soon. "We need to move," Jack said, already heading for the door. Now. They made their way through the compound, retracing their steps as quickly and quietly as they could. Every hallway, every corner felt like a potential threat. Lyra could hear the distant sound of alarms blaring in the distance, and she knew the cartel was onto them. They reached the landing pad where they had left their small ship, but just as they were about to board, the doors at the far end of the bay burst open. Dozens of cartel soldiers poured in, weapons raised and ready for a fight. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. They were surrounded. "Looks like they're not giving up without a fight," Jack said, his voice calm but full of tension. Lyra gripped her weapon tightly, her mind racing. They couldn't take on all of them. There were too many, but they couldn't give up now. They had come too far. Jack glanced around the landing pad, his eyes quickly scanning for an escape route. "Follow me," he said, pulling Lyra toward a nearby maintenance tunnel. They dashed through the narrow tunnel, the sounds of gunfire and shouting fading behind them. Lyra's lungs burned as they ran, but she didn't stop. Jack led the way, moving through the maze of corridors with ease. It was clear that he knew this place better than she had realized. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached another docking bay at the far side of the compound. There was another ship waiting, this one larger and more heavily armed. Jack didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the ship and began powering it up. Lyra's heart raced as she turned to look behind them. The sound of cartel soldiers closing in was growing louder. They didn't have much time. "Come on," Jack called, already at the controls. "We're almost out of here." Lyra rushed toward the ship, jumping into the cockpit beside Jack. As the ship lifted off the ground and soared into the sky, Lyra felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done it. They had escaped the cartel's clutches. For now. But as they flew away from the compound, Lyra knew that their fight was far from over. The cartel wouldn't stop chasing her. They would keep coming until they had what they wanted. And now, it was personal. The escape from the cartel's compound was only the beginning. As the ship soared through the stars, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the blackness of space. It felt too quiet, too still. The cartel had resources, and they wouldn't give up easily. They would be hunting her down. And soon, Jack and she would be forced into another fight for survival. Jack seemed calm, as usual. He kept his focus on the controls, his hand steady as he piloted the ship. Lyra couldn't help but admire how composed he was, but she also noticed something else. His eyes, though calm, seemed distant. He was hiding something. She could feel it. "Jack, what's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "You've been quiet. Is something wrong?" He didn't look at her right away, but after a moment, he sighed and leaned back in his seat. "We've got a problem. And it's not just the cartel." Lyra frowned. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Jack hesitated before speaking. "The data we stole from the cartel, it's not just information about their weapons. It's a list of names, people they've been working with, powerful people." He paused, his gaze turning dark. "People who have power over planets, people who can make life difficult for us." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. She had known that the cartel was dangerous, but this was bigger than she had imagined. They were up against more than just criminals. They were up against a web of corruption and influence that spanned the galaxy. "So, what now?" she asked. "What's our next move?" Jack met her gaze, his expression hardening. "We need to destroy that data. But there's someone I need to see first. Someone who can help us take down the cartel for good." Lyra nodded, sensing that this person Jack was talking about might be the key to ending everything. But there was something about his tone that made her uneasy. She didn't trust easily, and something about Jack's words didn't sit right with her. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice steady. Jack hesitated. "It's someone from my past. Someone who owes me a favor." Lyra's instincts screamed at her, but she pushed them aside. She had to trust Jack. He had saved her life, and they had come this far together. She couldn't back out now. The ship continued its journey through space, heading for a distant system. Jack didn't give many details, but Lyra didn't press him. She had learned that Jack was a man of few words. When he spoke, it was usually because it mattered. After a few hours of silence, they arrived at a small, isolated moon. The place was far from any major colony or civilization. It was the perfect spot to lay low. At least, that's what Lyra thought at first. The ship touched down in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees. It was eerily quiet, and Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jack stood up from his seat and turned to her. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll be back soon." Lyra opened her mouth to protest, but Jack had already stepped out of the ship before she could say anything. She watched through the window as he disappeared into the forest, leaving her alone in the small ship. The silence seemed to press in on her. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Minutes passed, and then hours. Lyra began pacing back and forth, her mind racing with questions. Why was Jack acting so strange? Why had he brought her here, to this desolate moon? The longer she waited, the more uncertain she became. Finally, just as the sun began to set, Lyra heard footsteps outside the ship. She rushed to the door, her hand on the weapon at her side. But when the door opened, it wasn't Jack who stood there. Instead, it was a group of armed men, wearing dark uniforms and cold expressions. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the insignia on their uniforms. They were from the cartel. Before she could react, one of the men lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her out of the ship. The others surrounded her, weapons drawn, their faces grim. "Jack betrayed you," one of the men said, his voice cold. "He's working for us now." Lyra's world seemed to shatter in that moment. Betrayal. It wasn't something she had expected, not from Jack. He had saved her life, protected her. But now, everything made sense. The silence, the distant look in his eyes, the secrecy. Jack had played her. Tears burned in Lyra's eyes, but she fought them back. She wouldn't let them see her weakness. She had to stay strong, even if the world had turned against her. Just as they were about to bind her hands, a loud crash echoed through the forest. The sound of blaster fire rang out, followed by a shout. A figure emerged from the trees, moving fast. It was Jack. But he wasn't alone. He was leading a group of rebels, people who had been fighting the cartel in secret. They moved quickly, taking down the cartel soldiers with deadly precision. Jack rushed toward Lyra, his eyes full of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice urgent. "I had to make it look like I betrayed you. I never wanted them to know about you. But I couldn't let them win." Lyra looked at him, her heart torn. She didn't know whether to trust him again. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She had a chance to take down the cartel for good. And she would need Jack's help to do it. The cartel soldiers lay scattered across the ground, their bodies motionless. But the danger wasn't over yet. Jack and Lyra stood side by side, breathing heavily, their weapons ready. The rebels had cleared the area, but the sound of reinforcements coming could still be heard in the distance. The cartel would not give up easily, not when they were this close to crushing their enemies. Jack glanced at Lyra, his expression serious. "We've got to move fast," he said. "They'll send more troops, and we need to get the data to the rebel leaders. This fight isn't over yet." Lyra nodded. She still wasn't sure how to feel about Jack's betrayal, but right now, there was no time to question it. The cartel had nearly destroyed everything she cared about, and the only way to make sure they paid for it was to keep fighting. They rushed toward the edge of the forest, where the rest of the rebel group was waiting. The leader, a tall man with dark hair and a hardened look, stood at the front. He had been watching them approach, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Jack, Lyra," the rebel leader greeted them. "Good to see you made it out. We got a transport waiting, but it won't be long before the cartel realizes we're here." "We've got the data," Jack said, pulling out the small chip from his pocket. "This could change everything." The rebel leader nodded. "Good. Let's get out of here before more cartel forces arrive." The group moved quickly, staying low to the ground as they made their way toward the transport ship. The forest was dense, the shadows growing longer as the sun set. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig made Lyra jump. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts told her they were being hunted. "We're almost there," the rebel leader whispered. "Stay sharp." But just as they reached the clearing where the transport ship was waiting, the sound of engines filled the air. A group of cartel gunships appeared overhead, their dark shapes cutting through the sky. Lyra's heart raced. The cartel had found them. "Move," Jack shouted. The rebels ran for the ship, with Jack and Lyra bringing up the rear. The gunships fired, their weapons lighting up the sky with bright, deadly bursts of energy. Lyra ducked behind a tree as debris flew past her. She could feel the heat from the explosions, hear the shrill sound of plasma blasts. "Get to the ship," the rebel leader yelled, his voice full of urgency. The rebels piled into the transport, one by one, as the gunships closed in. Jack was the last to climb aboard, pulling Lyra up with him. Just as the last door slammed shut, the transport shot into the air, narrowly avoiding a blast that hit the ground where they had been standing just seconds before. "We've got company," the pilot said, his voice tense. "Hold on tight." The ship banked hard to the left, evading another attack. Lyra grabbed the seat in front of her, trying to steady herself. She glanced at Jack, who was sitting next to her, his eyes scanning the skies for more threats. "Are we going to make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes focused on the ship's controls. The gunships were relentless, following closely behind, their weapons firing with deadly precision. Lyra could hear the roar of their engines, feel the vibrations as the transport dodged another blast. "We need to lose them," Jack said, his voice cold. "Prepare yourself." Without warning, Jack hit a button on the console, and the ship veered into a sharp dive. The world outside twisted as the transport descended toward the planet below, weaving between the trees and rocky outcrops. Lyra's stomach lurched, but she didn't have time to be afraid. She was too focused on the mission. The cartel had already caused too much pain in her life, and she wouldn't let them win. The gunships followed them, but they weren't built for the sharp turns and sudden drops of the transport. They lagged behind, their weapons firing blindly into the trees. "This is it," the pilot said, his voice strained. "We're almost at the rendezvous point." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she peered out the window. The trees gave way to a large clearing ahead, where another group of rebels was waiting. She could see them, their silhouettes standing in the distance. "Get ready," Jack said, gripping the seat in front of him. "This is where we make our stand." The transport hit the ground with a hard thud, but it was smooth enough for the rebels to leap out quickly. Lyra was among the first to hit the dirt, her weapon drawn and ready. The cartel gunships were closing in, but they wouldn't have time to reload or reorganize. This was their final chance. The rebels formed a perimeter around the ship, their weapons raised. Lyra could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. This was it, the last stand. Either they would win, or the cartel would destroy them all. The gunships hovered overhead, their blasters aimed directly at the rebels below. Lyra didn't hesitate. She aimed at the nearest gunship and fired. The shot hit its target, and the ship exploded in a burst of fire and metal. "Keep fighting," Jack shouted, his voice full of urgency. "Don't let up." Lyra didn't need any more motivation. She fired again, taking down another gunship. Her pulse raced with adrenaline, but she stayed focused. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting back. The cartel soldiers scattered, unable to keep up with the rebels' fierce resistance. With each shot, the cartel's grip on the planet weakened, until finally, the last of their forces retreated. Lyra stood there, breathing heavily, her eyes fixed on the wreckage of the gunships. She had fought hard, and she had won. The cartel was broken, and the rebellion had a chance to rebuild. Jack stood beside her, his face grim but resolute. "We did it," he said, his voice full of relief. "We've made them pay." Lyra nodded, her heart swelling with pride. But the fight's not over yet. The rebellion was just beginning, and she would be there, leading the charge.